microphone for me there. For those who haven't already, the first and second levels of Sabbath school will be meeting in the back during this time if you haven't already gone. Pardon me real quick here. I want to echo my thanks to Maggie for that beautiful music. I have the utmost respect for anybody who can do special music. That scares the living daylights out of me. Speaking doesn't bother me, but man, to do something like that would scare me to no end. All right, there we go. So I knew they were going to be closed behind me, and you all might be staring at those, trying to pick out what you might get. So I went ahead and made a presentation today to try to distract you a little bit, hopefully. We'll see. And it's great to be back with you after our holiday season last week. In Revelation 20, verse 8 and 9, the scripture we look at very commonly as we come during the Feast of Tabernacles, and especially coming down almost to the last great day, we see a momentous occasion. The end of time, if you will, the end of the timeline, the leading into the creation of the new heavens and new earth. But in Revelation 28 and 9, we see that Satan is one more time released from his prison, and he goes out and he gathers together with him an army called Gog and Magog, and they come and surround the city of Jerusalem, and in doing so, God sends down fire and destroys Gog and Magog, and then Satan is then cast in verse 10 into the lake of fire in the pit with the beast and the false prophet. It is the conclusion. It is the ending to that evilness. And we oftentimes read that scripture and we look at it because we focus on it's the destruction of Satan, isn't it? But it's the destruction of two things. Satan is destroyed, and this army called Gog and Magog, which is referenced a few times in the Bible, as we'll go through today, is also destroyed wholeheartedly on the face of the earth. And that's important. And I think it's important for us to look at. This has been a study, an area that I've looked into for a long period of time, and I find it very fascinating because this army of Gog and Magog that is present has existed really from the beginning of time, at least in the time that we know it. If we can trace them all the way back, going back to the time of Judah and Israel in the biblical times, that have always been a presence and had a presence in shaping history, in shaping minds, and in shaping the course of prophetic events. And they've always served one primary purpose, so that nations will know that I am the Lord. That is the purpose of this army of Gog and Magog, so that the people will know who and what God is. And we're going to take a chance, and we're going to go through, and we're going to look at this today and see how it is. And we're going to look at who Gog and Magog are. Secondly, we're going to take a look and see that how is it that they point people to help them to know God, to serve this purpose in this quote that you see behind me. And third, we're going to see why they are lumped in with Satan and they're destroyed in the end time, and why it is they have to be utterly destroyed for that new heaven, that new earth to finally come down. So let's go back to the beginning. You see we've got a timeline. We're going to be working our way throughout all of history today in the next hour, or less than an hour, hopefully. So be ready. Pens are ready to write. Gog and Magog is not really a big mystery of who they are, and the church has been teaching the same thing, and honestly, even most evangelical literature identifies Gog and Magog as an army, a great horde of Russian and or Chinese descent that really comes out of the northwest aspect of the Holy Land. They're often referred to as this horde from the north. Now, today we call them Russia and China. If you were to read United Church of God's literature, that's what they would be identified on, and that's correct, but that's a modern construct. If we're going to look at them through time, the ideas of China and Russia are current countries. They have existed for long before then. Now, China has been a country in some sort of form going back pretty far. Russia, obviously, is a more recent kind of addition. But when we're really talking about the concept of Gog and Magog, what we're talking about is what you see on the left-hand side here is this land called the Central Eurasian Steppe. Oh, I'm not linked. Oh, I'm buffering. That's not good. Donald and I practiced this like 4 times, too, that we would try to make it work. Hey, can you just hit present? And then hit the bottom arrow. The other one. 2 more times. There you go. You're going to be my clicker today. I don't have a whole lot of clicks, so it shouldn't be too bad. What we're focusing on is this area on the left here, the Central Eurasian steppe land. The steppe, S-T-E-P-P-E, is this giant grassland that exists in both Europe and Asia, the area we would call today the Balkans, Ukraine, Romania, sweeping down through the Urals across what would be Kazakhstan, into Mongolia and over into parts of China. This is an area that has housed for generations going all the way back this wide open grass steppe lands that nomadic tribes, akin to almost the North American Indians that we would think about from kind of the pre-colonial days, of nomadic people that roamed this area free, mainly on horseback. They did not build cities. They did not build farms. They were people that just kind of traversed this entire land. And every once in a while, they would coalesce into a nation and sweep down and become a part of history, as we'll see, and then return back into this land. This land is brutal. This land is hard to live in. 9 months out of the year, it is drastic winter conditions. The other 3 months, it's hot, burning sun with blistering heat and winds that made it very hard to live in. And so these people would live primarily on what only they had on their backs. And on their backs with their horse. They would set up tents, and they would move around to find food. They primarily only ate animals. They ate meat and milk. That was their diet. They did not grow crops. They did not farm lands. They did not build cities. They just moved around throughout this entire area. But they had two things that they were commonly known for. And this goes back to the times of Israel and Judah. All the way through, as you would see, these people would still be on the world scene just exactly how they had been at that time, till about the 1800s. Living in this land was so hard, they didn't change a whole lot up until modern days. They were known for two things: riding horses. They were the first to domesticate the horse. They were the first to create chariots. They would start riding horses before they would walk. Their kids under the age of 1 would start to ride a horse, and they were so adept at it, nobody in the history of mankind has ever been so good. The second thing they had was the bow. They were the most expert bow hunters, and sometimes bow warriors, that has ever walked the face of this earth. There are stories of these people, their armies. The entire nation would be part of their army. They could travel and fire with their bow, which was so strong it took 10 years to learn how to fire it, because it was so powerful to pull back and so powerful it could go the length of 5 football fields with accuracy. They could fire over 10 arrows in 1 minute while riding at full speed on a horse, riding off to the side, shooting up underneath the neck of the horse, and hit a target 10 times out of 10 in a bullseye that big. They were exquisite hunters. They were exquisite warriors. And that is the aspect that becomes because they were some of the most destructive people in the history of mankind. They were cruel. They were evil. And they would come down, and if you faced them in battle, you rarely lived to tell the tale. There is a concept in history that states, history is written by the victors. But what if one of the most mighty armies that has ever existed in the history of mankind for millennia didn't believe in writing anything down? These people were nomadic horse people. They didn't have cities. They didn't have teachers. They didn't believe in all that. They didn't write their own stories. And most of the nations that came in contact with them did not live to tell the tale either. They were one of the most powerful people throughout all of history, and we know of them through rumors. We know of them through some of their contacts with people on the side. Look at how far that swath goes all the way over to China. There are historical accounts of the Chinese dealing with these people called the Xiongnu, which were a people of the nomadic horse tribes that would fight and deal in their land and come in and sweep into their places, and they were able to finally eject them, and then they built something that we all can still see today. It's the Great Wall of China. It was created to keep these people off their borders. The Greeks tell the tale of a mythological creature called the centaur, which was half man and half horse, and who carried a bow. And it came from their dealings with these people who came from their northern boundaries. The concept of the Amazonian princess, this warrior female who was so adept in battle, comes from another one of these nomadic tribes, whose only women were the primary battle holders in their society, and a woman couldn't get married until she had bested a man in battle and killed him. And there are stories of some of them who never would marry into their later ages, because they were never able to win on the battlefield. These people were destructive. They were able to wipe in and clean out, and then they would just leave. They would sweep in time through history, and then they would sweep out. And their stories and their aspects are some of the most powerful things we've ever seen. You can go. In Daniel chapter 2, we then get check. In Daniel 2, we get a prophecy. where Nebuchadnezzar as king is given this vision, and he brings Daniel in, and through God's inspiration is able to see. And it's this powerful vision of the head of gold, the body of silver, bronze, iron, and clay going down. And it's God telling Nebuchadnezzar with Daniel's interpretation of what is going to happen from the great empires that would exist throughout his day. And he tells him in Daniel's, it will show this is going to be you, great king. You will be the head of gold, followed by the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, coming down into the Roman Empire. And God is giving this vision and telling Nebuchadnezzar, but also the people who are in captivity there for a reason. There's 3 reasons for this specific prophecy. 1, God is telling his people that he is in control. He determines the timing and the course of the nations, when they rise and when they fall, and he sets the boundaries of those nations. He sets up rulers in accordance with his will, and he brings them down when he chooses. And he's telling Nebuchadnezzar, I will set you up, but there will be others after you, and I am the one who's in control. It's a good lesson for us to understand in the modern age as well. The second thing, the purpose of this prophecy, is that God is telling Israel that their existence has not been in vain. There is still a purpose for them. They play a role in the first coming of Christ, and they will play a key role in the second coming as well. We'll touch back on this aspect a little bit later. But the third thing that is the purpose of this prophecy is God's judgment is in his hands, and he does not hesitate to execute his righteousness. And Gog and Magog is what we're going to begin to see here, were a method by which he would go about doing that. Because none of these 4 empires that Daniel 2 talks about, that Daniel deals with throughout his entire prophetic aspect, none of them existed in a vacuum. He's talking about Babylon here in the first case, and Babylon could not exist until the most powerful nation that had existed for hundreds of years beforehand, that had always kept them in check, was destroyed. And so, what we begin to see is not just this timeline of the empires that we know about, because they all wrote things down, but we begin to see that they don't exist, and this timeline that Daniel tells us does not exist also without the ability of these people, these nomadic horse riders, this Gog and Magog armies from the north and from the west, would have to come down and set the stage. In 606, which is the time the book of Daniel is written in chapter 2, where Nebuchadnezzar is set up as the great king, just 7 years before then, for them to be able to do it, the Assyrian Empire had to be destroyed. Babylon wasn't strong enough to do that. Through history, they were never able to. They always would fight against them, and they couldn't do it. Assyria was a mighty, powerful nation of extreme wickedness and extreme temperamentality. They were cruel people. But God finally coalesced a group of people called the Scythians, who were a nomadic steppe tribe of people, these horse archers who would move around the area, and then one day they come down with another nomadic horse archer people called the Medes, who we'll know more about as we come into the Persians. And in 613, just 7 years before Babylon is set up, they came down and they destroyed Nineveh, and then all the rest of the great cities of the Assyrian Empire. And they didn't just destroy them, they wiped them out completely. To the point that 200 years after their destruction, the Greek philosopher and historian Xenophon will tell the story of a Greek raiding party coming through the land of the Tigris River, and they would come along this mighty city sitting out in the middle of nowhere, completely abandoned. The walls were massive, bigger than anything that existed 200 years in this day. And they look upon it and they ask, who would live here? Who was mighty enough to hold this land? They had never heard of the Assyrian Empire just 200 years later. Xenophon tells them of this story and what went on. The historian Sidney Smith in 1925, in a book that he wrote, quote, "The disappearance of the Assyrian people will always remain a unique and striking phenomenon in ancient history. Other similar kingdoms and empires have indeed passed away, but the people have lived on. No other land seems to have been sacked and pillaged as completely as Assyria." In 1 Samuel 15, God goes to Saul and he tells him, I want you to battle with Agag and the Amalekites because they are so cruel. I don't want you to take any prisoners. I want you to destroy them. Men, women, children, animals, everything. Take no plunder, take no items. I want this city destroyed completely. Now, Saul wins the battle with God's help, but we know the story that he doesn't. They take gold and silver, and they leave some of the people alive, going against God's way of life. Gog and Magog and the people of these nomadic horse archers, they follow that principle to a T. And when they destroyed the Assyrian Empire, it never ceased to be again. And honestly, throughout history, most people didn't even know existed until we got to about the 1900s when they first started to discover some of these aspects from that time frame because they were destroyed completely, and their cities were powerful. And so with their destruction, Babylon now is strong enough to rise up. So Gog and Magog were this counter force that exists to allow God's plan to happen. They are a force that God used to allow his plan to take effect. And so Babylon rises up and becomes mighty. It takes Judah off into captivity as God said they would. And for a long time, they had some of these nomadic horse people as friends of theirs. The Medes, as we mentioned before, which helped the Scythians destroy, were sitting on the northern part of what we call Iran now. And as we know, the Persian Empire, though, would have to become to rise up. And Cyrus is their great general and leader who has eventually risen up. But for him to get powerful enough to defeat the Babylonians, he wasn't strong enough either. First, he had to conquer those Medes who were on his northern border and assimilate them into his own society. And so he goes to battle against the king named Astyages and incorporates them in. And now all of a sudden he's strong enough, and Persia is able to fight and defeat and go against Babylon themselves. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 13, because Isaiah has a prophecy about this very fact. Isaiah 13, if you could. Isaiah 13:1 says, "This is a burden against Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw." In verse 4, it says, "A noise of a multitude in the mountains, like that of many people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations, gather together. The Lord of hosts musters an army for battle." So God is calling this army. God is bringing these people together. "They come from a far country, from the end of heaven, the Lord and his weapons of indignation to destroy the whole land." Some translations call that his instruments of his indignation. As we drop down to verse 17, we see who he's talking about here is the Medes. The Medes were one of these Gog and Magog, Central Eurasian steppe people. But he calls them his weapons of indignation. "This is the army I will raise to destroy you, Babylon, because although I set you up, I am the one who is in control of history. I am the one who will take you down. And your actions have been judged, and they have been poor, and I will bring my weapons of indignation against you." And so God rises up. As we read down in verse 17, "Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, who will not regard silver, and as for gold, they will not delight in it. And their bows will dash the young men to pieces, and they will have no pity on the fruit of the womb. Their eye will not spare the children. And Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah." Complete and utter destruction. The same thing they did when they faced the Assyrians. They had no cities to take plunder back to. They didn't care about gold. What does gold and silver amass to someone who has to carry everything he owns on the back of his horse? They have no need for gold or silver. They had no need for slaves. They had no need to leave anyone alive. They would do those things that Saul would not do, as we saw back in 1 Samuel 15. They would come in as the weapons of God's indignation, as the instruments of his tools, to destroy these people, and once again then set the course of history, allowing Daniel 2 to continue with the rising of the Persian Empire. Now, soon after his setting up, Cyrus, the king of Persia, who establishes the Persian Empire, is killed, once again chasing after one of these Gog and Magog armies called the Mazzakatai. And so he falls, and his son Cambyses takes over. And soon we come down to Darius I, the great ruler of the Persian Empire, who really sets them as one of the preeminent powers of the day. They become so large, they are undefeated. They move around and conquer everything they come in contact with. They are a massive army that has not been seen from to this day. But then at one point, Darius makes a foolish decision, one that has been made many times throughout history. He decides, I want to go up because I'm sick of these Scythians once again. They're still on the world scene. I'm sick of them kind of nitpicking a little bit along my periphery. I don't like them there. I'm going to go up and I'm going to wipe them out. Now, these armies were so difficult as it was when they came into your own land and fought against you and sieged your own cities. They were unstoppable if you tried to come onto their home turf. Because as we saw what that land is like, there is nothing to stop them. They don't have a city to besiege. They are a moving band of people that move around as need be. And Darius musters his army, and Herodotus, the Greek historian, accounts this, and he goes up north. And they travel up and they cross through Anatolia. They move in across what we call today Istanbul, and going from Asia into Europe, up into the Ukraine, Romania, and the Balkans, and he's chasing them. He keeps chasing them, and the Scythians just move. They're all horse people. They just move. They're like, what are you to us? And Darius gets frustrated, and he sends riders to the king of the Scythians, a man named Idianthros, and he says, why won't you turn and fight me? Come on, I'm here to take you on. Turn and fight, and if not, offer me gifts of bread or gifts of earth and water, because that's what the Persians asked for anyone who would sit down and cause fealty to them. They wanted a gift of earth and water. And I find it interesting as kind of a highlight of how these people thought. So Idianthros, the king of the Scythians, sends back a letter, and he says, quote, "This is my situation, Persian. I have not fled from anyone out of fear before. I am not fleeing from you now. What I have been doing is in fact no different than what I am accustomed to doing in times of peace. I'll tell you why I do not engage you, because I have neither towns nor cultivated land to worry about being captured or razed, which in doing thus would force us to engage you in battle sooner. But I do have ancestral graves if you really want to come after us. So come on then, find them, and try to destroy them. You will know whether or not we will fight for our graves, but before that, we shall not engage you in battle unless we see fit to do so. And then he continued on and said, instead of gifts in earth and water, I shall send you the tokens which you really merit. And in response to your claims to be my master, I tell you, weep. And he sent him instead of earth and water, a frog, a mouse, a bird, and 5 arrows. The implication being, unless you can swim like a frog, fly like a bird, or burrow like a mouse, you shall die by my arrows. And he just says, I'm not going to deal with you. And he moved on. These people faced down the greatest empire in the world at the time and said, no, you're not worthy of us. We'll keep moving. Now is not the time for us to fight you. And they never did. And so Darius is also upset, and he's sitting up here in this land in the Balkans, and where he's sitting is just north of Greece. Until this time, the Persian Empire had no knowledge of the Greeks even being people, and same vice versa. The Greeks didn't know who the Persians were. But now all of a sudden they were on each other's doorstep. And the Greeks look up and they see this mighty army sitting on top of them, and they foolishly attack it and are destroyed utterly. And this destruction makes the Persian Empire turn, and they look down and they see this very rich land, not that powerful, and they decide now will be the time for us to engage with those Greeks. Until this point, they didn't even know each other existed. And this starts the great battles of Darius and his sons and Xerxes that come in, the great battle of the 300 Spartans holding the Thermopylae gates, the battle of Marathon, where a rout is done where the Athenians win and a man runs 26.2 miles, delivering the great news that they had survived and then falls over dead. The stories that have come to us through history because the Greeks and the Persians write things down. The other people didn't. We only know that letter that Dianthropos sends to Darius because Herodotus, the Greek historian, accounts for it. We don't know about these great armies that sit up there because they didn't write anything down. But now they're chasing after these Scythian people, force them to turn their attention. And now we see the Persians start battling the Greeks. And for 200 years they would battle, eventually leading to the Greeks getting up and raising up an army strong enough that they defeated the Persians and become the great power of the day. And we come down then to 330 BC, and now we have Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander was he is what many are considered one of the most wise leaders of all time, from a militarily standpoint at least. He, too, made the same mistake and tried to go up north into that Eurasian steppe land and met the same results that everyone else did, and quickly turned his attention south and went over towards India, Persia, and went over and did most of his conquering in different sections. He would have no other help in that area as well. But then he would die. His reign was short and burned very quickly, and when he died, his land was broken into 4 different empires. The largest and the most powerful of which was called Seleucia, or the Seleucid dynasty, after the general Seleucus, who was one of his main generals. This area would encompass the Middle East, the area formerly of Babylon, of Persia, and all this region, and they would become the dominant Greek people of the time. And this we read about in the end of the book of Daniel, the intertestamental period of the Maccabees, and the times that really set up the times of Christ coming later. But just like any nation and just like any, they all begin to fall. And so we see kind of between the years of 238 and 148, what brings down these Greek empires is, once again, these people sweeping down from the Central Eurasian steppe land, these horse archers of Gog and Magog. In this place, it was the people called the Parthians. And in 323, they attack, and in 245, they attack and they wipe out Antiochus II and his armies and take over a large portion of it. His son, Antiochus III, was able to take a lot of it back. But in 148, the Parthians once again revolt, and they conquer the city of Seleucia. And they take back the lands of the Tigris and the Euphrates and the Holy Land and all of that region, and us ending the Greek rule of this time period. And in doing so, they establish their own Parthian empire, taking over these lands, which then allows the Romans to begin to come down. You see, Gog and Magog's purpose was always to help raise up the new one and bring down that which needed to come down for the next one to come on the scene. We know about the 4 big ones, but these are the people who are working the backgrounds to make it possible. Now, the Romans would deal with these Parthians as well, and they would have the Roman-Parthian battles, which are interesting if you would ever want to read into those as well, as the Romans had a hard time with them as well. But this is what allows that Greek empire, which burned so hot under Alexander the Great, to finally start to crumble down and allowing the Romans to come in. And we all know the Romans last for a long period of time. In 27 BC, we have the establishment of the Roman Empire, and they last for hundreds of years, and their power is greater than anything we've ever seen. But all great nations and all great empires have to come to an end. Now, for years, they had fought and dealt with battles of these Germanic tribes that sat to their north and to their to their east. But they were always to keep them at bay. They were fearsome fighters. They could never really take over all these Germanic tribes. They could fight them to a stalemate, but they were very powerful people. But then as we come into the 300s, a new group of people, and Attila the Hun comes onto the stage, sweeping in from the Central Eurasian area through Hungary, through Romania. Hungary is named after the Huns, if you didn't catch that part. And Attila the Hun is so fearsome of a warrior. These people come in, and they're fully tattooed. They would scar their faces as children. They looked disgusting, and they were cruel, and they were evil, and they were the biggest fighters at that time. And now all of a sudden, these big Germanic tribes that we think of who are afraid of nothing are falling like dominoes. First, he takes over the Alans. Then they defeat the Ostrogoths. And then the Visigoths, these strong Germanic people, drop their weapons and go running. And they run to the Roman Empire, who they've been fighting for generations, and they say, please let us in. Please grant us protection. We can't deal with these people. They're too powerful for us. And their ruler asks for asylum, if you will, for all their people on the western border. And the Romans let them in. They make them disarm all their weapons first, and they bring them in and assimilate them into the Roman culture. Well, unfortunately, they don't treat them very well, and all those Germanic people are now within their borders, these people they had been fighting for years, and they rise up, culminating in 378 in the Battle of Adrianople, which is considered the final nail in the coffin of destroying the Roman Empire. It was the Visigoths living within their own walls who destroyed them, but they're only there because Attila the Hun and his people, his Gog and Magog army, pushed them there because they were too powerful for them. And Attila the Hun would sweep up through Gaul, which is modern-day France and Spain and other areas, and take lots of other pieces and destroy the rest of the Roman Empire that was sitting off on the edges, and battle of all these places and destroy all of them, wiping them off, then eventually retreat back into the hinterland. And that brings us all the way through Daniel 2's vision. None of these nations exist or could continue on without it. Now, throughout, they didn't stop becoming a powerful force. I won't go through all of it, but we know there are 10 resurrections of the Holy Roman Empire that then exist afterwards. And many of them, if you were to look into them, really have a place, and they dealt with these same Gog and Magog armies. Charlemagne was established in 1800 as the first Holy Roman Empire. It's the second resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire that we look at, the 10 resurrections through time. Charlemagne is a Germanic tribesman of those Visigoth people. He's only as part of that Roman Empire because they were pushed there by the Huns. This is how, after hundreds of years after the defeat of Roman Empire and these dark ages where we don't have a lot of history, and then Charlemagne establishes himself, and now Rome goes from being an Italian state to a German state. And he has created Holy Roman Empire up in the city of Aachen, which is in modern-day Germany. We see in 1095 the Seljuk Turks, which were another army of this Gog and Magog, who come sweeping in and sack and go after Constantinople, the city in Byzantium at the time. This causes the leader of the time to ask for help of the Pope, and we start the Crusades. These Crusades start in response to these same actions. In 1258, Genghis Khan, and then later on his son, would come sweeping in. These were the greatest warriors of all time. If you were to consider even all these different people, these Gog and Magog armies, none were greater than Genghis Khan. And his army and horde comes sweeping down and sacks Baghdad in 1258 AD. Baghdad at the time was the most powerful city in the world. The Islamic countries of that area were the most powerful from an artistic standpoint, from a science standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, as well as a military standpoint. And they dominated the world. The Christian areas of Europe were nothing compared to them and could not stop their incursions and could not stop. They were so wise. Genghis Khan comes down and besieges them. Well, actually not him. It was his son who finally knocked it down and destroys Baghdad so thoroughly that it did not regain its population until the 1950s. This was the greatest city in the world at the time, and it was destroyed to that same level that we read about of Assyria and Babylon. Nobody survived it. Even into the modern age, we see Napoleon invading Russia and getting stopped. We see Hitler 100 years later doing the same thing. Even the Princess Bride tells us of this premise. You don't get into a land war in Asia. How many of these great rulers didn't learn that lesson? And no one ever seems to have been able to do it ever since. So even the Princess Bride's prophetic. So we come through the course of human history. That's my quick 6,000-year look at human history and how it has been shaped by these people who have always existed on the periphery, who have always existed in the background, but we know of them, and we know of what they did, because their results are what we know about. Their results are what we've lived with. But then we're going to see a change, and we're going to come to a new time, because Christ is going to return. And the 6,000-year reign of man will change, because the Lord, however, is a God of justice. And while the first 6,000 years were dominated by mankind, the nations were set up and brought down by God's will, many of the times at the hands of his agents. When Christ returns, he is going to be changing that culture. And so we transition ourselves into a times of Christ, where we see now the largest prophecy of these people of Gog and Magog. And as we go to Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, which both of these chapters are dealing with this prophecy against Gog and Magog. And where we're at from a standpoint now is we're at the beginning of the millennium. So the millennial time, Christ returns, the battle of Armageddon occurs, and people are wiped out. And I can only imagine the shell shock that is going to exist. I can only imagine there are going to be a lot of people who are confused. There are going to be a lot of people who have to learn. You know, if we go over to, before we go to Ezekiel, let's go to Isaiah 2. Because this kind of sets the stage of what we're going to be seeing and what it's like at this time. Isaiah 2:2, we have a song that we read about, we sing about this. And it says, "Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. And many shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of Jacob. He will teach us his ways. And we shall walk in his paths, and out of Zion shall go forth the law." This early stage of the millennium, this, I don't know if it's some years, decades, or whatnot, soon after the establishment of this time, people are going to have to learn. They're not going to just know. They're not going to just be able to put away. Now, Satan's gone. His influence isn't there, but it'll be upon us and God's people to start to teach them. And they're not going to know what's going to happen, and they're going to have to figure, who is God? What is his purpose? Zechariah 14, verses 16 through 18, we always read about is the prophecy of that future time where Egypt, if they don't go up during the Feast of Tabernacles, won't get rain. There's going to be people who don't understand. The millennium won't just be brought in with Christ's second return and boom, everybody's going to be ready to go and everyone's going to understand what's going on. There's going to be a process of learning and of educating and of teaching these people, and they're going to need to learn who God is. And so with that, let's now go back to Ezekiel 38. And so we have this prophecy of this same time frame, these early phases, this early stage of the millennial rule. And Ezekiel 38, and we're going to jump through scriptures here instead of reading all of it because we have 2 full chapters of this prophecy. Ezekiel 38, verse 4 says, "I will turn you around and put hooks in your jaws and lead you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all splendidly clothed." He's talking about Gog and Magog, and God's saying, I am going to lead you. So he is the one who is establishing these people. Once again, these are his agents of destruction, if you will. I am going to lead you. We'll drop down into verse 8. And says, "After many days you will be visited. In the latter years you will come into the land of those brought back from the sword, and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which have long been desolate. And they have brought you other nations, and now all of them dwell safely." He's re-brought Israel back into Mount Sinai, or back into Jerusalem, and he's regained all of his people back. In verse 9, "And you will ascend," now talking of Gog and Magog, "coming like a storm, covering the land like a cloud, you and your troops and many peoples with you." And we drop down to verse 15. It says, Then you will come from your place out of the far north, and your many peoples with you, all of them riding on horses, a great company and a mighty army. And you will come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. And it will be in the latter days that I will bring you against my land, so that the nations will know me. And when I am hallowed in you, O Gog, before their eyes." Just like has been happening in history for 6,000 years, this great horde of an army on horseback with bows will sweep into this land. And for 6,000 years, whenever that happened, utter destruction came with them, and the people were afraid. Nobody ever wanted to face these people in battle, and now we're in this millennial period, and once again they are sweeping down and they are coming on. But we read on to verse 21, "And I will call a sword against Gog throughout all my mountains, says the Lord God. Every man's sword will be against his brother, and I will bring him to judgment with pestilence and bloodshed. I will rain down on him and his troops, and on many peoples who are with him, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire, and brimstone. Thus I will magnify myself and sanctify myself. I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am the Lord." That is their purpose. He is going to bring this great army down so that these people can finally understand and know that I am the Lord. That is why they exist. That's why they have always existed. God gave Daniel a prophecy in Daniel 2. Well, he gave it to Nebuchadnezzar that Daniel tells him, and I am going to set the course of history for the next few hundred years. And he followed it through by using these people. And in this case now, he's going to bring them down. He's going to surround the people in Israel, and he will wipe them out. The Israelites and the people around there won't have to lift a hand. God will wipe them out in their very course and show them, see, I am the one who can raise them up, and I am the one who can destroy them. And now you know that I am the Lord. We see two main lessons, and I think two purposes from this prophecy that we read about in Ezekiel 38 and 39. The first one we find, the first reason is over in Ezekiel 39, verse 22, as God continues to elaborate through the prophet Ezekiel. Chapter 39, verse 22, it says, "So the house of Israel shall know that I am the Lord their God from that day forward." The first purpose of Gog and Magog in this prophecy is so that the people of Israel will know that I am the Lord. Remember, what was that second reason I gave for what the book of Daniel is Daniel is telling these people, we've all been taken into captive. The Assyrian Empire had wiped out the first 10 tribes. Babylon at this time had taken away the nations of Judah. But God still had a purpose for his people. God would still be a redeemer for his people, and I will bring them back. And here he's showing them, here, house of Israel, I am doing this because I am your God. Through time, the armies of these people, this Gog and Magog armies from the central Eurasian steppe lands, have come sweeping down like a force, and standing in their way usually meant utter destruction. But if we drop down to verse 25 here and continue on, it says, "Now, therefore, thus says the Lord God, now I will bring back the captives of Jacob, and have mercy on the whole house of Israel, and I will be jealous for my holy name. After they have borne their shame and all their unfaithfulness, all which they were unfaithful to me, when they dwelt safely in their own land, and no one made them afraid. When I have brought them back from the peoples and gathered them out of their enemies' lands, and I am hallowed in the sight of my many nations, then they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who sent them into captivity among the nations, but also brought them back into their land, and left none of them captive any longer. And I will not hide my face from them anymore, and I shall have poured out my spirit on the house of Israel, thus says the Lord." He is bringing back his people. He is redeeming his people. He is bringing them back to a nation that has been not existed since going all the way back from before those prophecies we looked at the beginning. And the purpose of this is he's showing them, I am in control, and I am bringing you back, and I am now reestablishing you. God is showing he's in control, and he can bring an army to bear, and he can destroy it. The other lesson of this scripture is, let's go back to verse 39, or chapter 39 and verse 21 now. And he says, "I will set my glory among the nations. All the nations shall see my judgment which I have executed, and my hand which I have seen." And we read 22 just a second ago, said it's for the purpose of Israel. But verse 23 says, "The Gentiles shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity, because they were unfaithful to me. Therefore I hid my face from them, and I gave them to the hand of their enemies, and they fell by the sword." Not only is the nation of Israel going to be redeemed and brought back and shown that he is the Lord, but now the Gentiles will see it as well. Remember, we're talking about a new time here. Satan is bound. And now is the time to bring all the people together. And Israel is brought back into their homeland, but it's also for the Gentiles as well. He sets up Israel and promises them what he's been promising from the beginning. I'm giving you back your homeland, but Gentiles, you too can see my power. You too can see that I am the Lord. And you can see that what I'm doing with my people, and I'm inviting you in to be part of that as well. This prophecy of Gog and Magog, when you read through it, is brutal. If you go through the earlier parts of verse 29, it shows that the destruction that will be meted out on this army that comes around and surrounds Israel will take 7 months to bury the dead, and everybody will have to participate in doing that. That's how big this army will be. That's how much the destruction is going to be. But it's for a purpose so these people can see, and now the Gentiles and the Israelites will be able to see God is the one in control. God is the one who has established this, and now the Gentiles can see the majesty and the power, and they can begin to go through the times of restoration that we look at, that really is what we all look for. Chapters 40 through 48 of Ezekiel deal with the reconstruction of the temple, followed then by the reconstruction of the city of Jerusalem, followed by the reconstruction of the promised land. To go through that process of reconciliation, of reconstruction, of bringing everything back, and what we always think about when we sit there at the Feast of Tabernacles and we think about what it's going to be like in the millennial reign, the positives, it can't get there till all the people are on board and ready. Those who aren't are destroyed. Those who want to get in line, those who have been redeemed back to their land, and those who didn't even know but now have seen the power are going to be involved with reconstructing the entire area. And everyone will be on board because Gog and Magog were once again used as an agent of God to show the people that he is the Lord. And this process of rebuilding can then begin. And so we go through the millennial time frame, and we come then to the end. We come down to the end, and we'll go back to Revelation chapter 20 and the new heavens and the new earth. And so the millennial period has gone through. And now we're at the final installment of the story, the final judgment of Satan and Gog and Magog, where they're destroyed by fire. And we see from the beginning of history that when God shows how he would intervene and direct the course of nations, that the people of Gog and Magog have been an instrument this entire time in shaping the course of nations, of who will be raised up and who would be judged. When the culmination of history happens, which is what Revelation 20 and 21 is, that is the whole purpose of those two scriptures, is to show the culmination of what is to come next, of which we have just a brief glimpse. Not only is he who has been doing the deceiving going to be destroyed, as we see in Revelation 20, verse 9 and 10, but also those who have been God's instruments of judgment were no longer going to be needed. We have seen throughout history here that Gog and Magog for the first 6,000 years have been God's weapons of his indignation, as he called them in Isaiah chapter 3, verse 5. They were used to rise up and to destroy nations, to mete out his judgment on nations in the world, and allow God to set the course of history as he deemed fit. During the millennial reign and during the millennial period, they were still a mighty army, but one who destruction this time, where before they always won, now their destruction would serve a purpose to act as a sign to show that God is still in control of history, as he always has been. But now he's raising up Israel and his people. And he's allowing the Gentiles to come into the fold as well and showing them and trying to show these people their way. And then here is the final scriptures that we read about with the coming new heavens and the new earth. Gog and Magog are no longer needed for either of these purposes. Now everybody will know. All things will be made new. Spirit or flesh will become spirit. God is sending fire down from heaven, not just to destroy he who has been the deceiver, but he's sending down fire to destroy those who have been made to carry out that way, to show people and to destroy and to mete out his judgment. He doesn't need that tool anymore. That's the beauty of that scripture. And we focus, and rightfully so, on the destruction of Satan, but God is also getting rid of that which he has used to put people in place and to rise up, because no longer will that weapon be needed. No longer is it going to be new. From the very beginning, Gog and Magog have had one purpose throughout all of this, one reason to exist, and they've been there from the beginning. It has been so that the nations will know that I am the Lord.